So you clicked a video about a guy who built a workbench. That's me. I built this workbench in about a week. I've got about $150 in materials wrapped up in it. And in my opinion, this will give me the flexibility as a beginning woodworker to work on a ton of different projects, to use the bench in a lot of different ways. And I think it's really smartly designed and easily approachable for a beginner. It's designed by a guy, a woodworker named Paulk. He's got a great YouTube channel I recommend you check out. And he sells these plans for this bench. So I recommend you support him and the time that he spent putting all these together for us woodworkers. It's got all the different cut lists and measurements that you need to build this thing. So definitely a great resource if you're looking to build a bench in similar style. So I put together this overview video on how a beginner can approach building a bench like this. I didn't have access to a lot of fancy tools or a super nice shop. This is just a 2-car garage, so there's some definite constraints, but constraints that I'm sure a lot of other people out there share. But there is definitely a more efficient and effective way to probably build this bench, and so I welcome your feedback in the comments below. You're not going to hurt my feelings. That's one of the main reasons I wanted to make this video, was to get some feedback from the rest of the woodworking community. So I hope you find this useful and interesting, and thanks for watching. And we're underway. I apologize in advance, I don't have a lot of footage of this initial layout and breaking down of the plywood, but definitely download Ron's plans. They give you all the measurements that you need to do this in both imperial and metric, which is kind of cool. One thing I would certainly recommend if you're like me and don't have a track saw or a table saw capable of breaking down large sheet goods like this is picking up the Kreg Rip Cut, which attaches to any old circular saw. I've got a hand-me-down circular saw from the 70s here that worked just fine, but the Kreg Rip Cut was indispensable for cutting straight cuts and being able to do this on a full-size sheet of plywood. Next is marking and drilling all the holes for the pocket screws that hold this entire bench together. It seems like pocket holes are a really hotly contested form of joinery in woodworking and, not considered legitimate by some people, but I'm here to tell you that as a beginner, this is a great, quick and easy way to put something together. And this bench is designed so well that, no matter how you decide to screw it together, it's going to be solid when you're said and done. Especially if you opt to go with 3/4 inch plywood like I did here, there's going to be no issues with stability on this bench. So screw it together however you like. I learned a lot about my preferred workflow while I was going through this build, and one thing that was pretty obvious early on was I really can't stand dust everywhere. So I found myself vacuuming almost every single hole that I drilled during the build. And my little 2.5 horsepower Craftsman shop vac was getting it done. Kreg, the makers of this pocket hole jig, recommend 6 to 8 inches on longer runs between screws, so that's what I opted for here on the longer cross braces for the side of the bench. But obviously on those shorter sides, I ended up going with a much closer spacing between screws. Last thing I'll mention about this part of the process, I'd recommend drilling the pocket holes in this stage, because once we cut out the holes for the tool storage and access to the middle of the bench, you're not going to have enough meat left on that plywood to clamp your pocket hole jig to and actually drill the holes. So I definitely recommend drilling the holes at this stage. And next up is actually cutting out or removing the center of those cross braces for the access to the middle of the bench. Now I know there's a lot of ways you could accomplish making these cuts. The first way that you're going to see me doing here is using a jigsaw to actually just follow the layout lines that I made. And that's honestly probably the quickest way. But I knew I wanted these to match on all sides. And so what you see me doing here is drilling some pilot holes for my jigsaw to slip into. I'm going to cut templates, basically one for the long side and one for the short cross braces. And then I'm going to use my router, which I actually have never used before, and this project was the first time. It seemed like a good opportunity to learn to use a router. But I'm going to use that to follow the template and just basically do a pattern cut on the subsequent pieces. And I also don't own a straight cut guide for my jigsaw, so here I am rigging up a level, 4-foot level, to use as a straight edge, but we're getting it done. And some more MacGyvering to lay out the rounded corners of those cutouts. I ended up using a pint of Minwax wood stain, just traced around the corners to get the radius I was looking for, and then followed it with the jigsaw. And I can fix the rest with sanding, right? And that's exactly what I did. So what I didn't film was me trying to do this first by hand with just a block sander, but that was an epic fail. So I ended up going to the hardware store and found these little sanding wheel attachments for my drill, which worked out perfectly. And then the real goal here, on top of just trying to fix any weird maneuvers with my jigsaw, was to make the template as smooth as possible, because I knew that if it wasn't, my router would get hung up when I'm trying to follow the template to cut the subsequent pieces. I suppose I didn't have to mark all these out, because I'll just be following them with the router anyway, but I know myself, I know that I'll probably make a miscut somewhere and waste some material if I don't make it painfully obvious where all my cuts need to happen. So never a bad idea just to have a little fail-safe for yourself. And I actually ended up being glad that I traced out those other pieces, because I don't own a plunge router, and trying to cut through 3/4 inch plywood in one pass with the router I do have probably would have been a challenge. So I opted to use my jigsaw to, get within maybe a 1/2 inch or a 1/4 inch of the line that I'll be routing out later. And that way, when I do go to route, it's going to have a lot less material to go through and just be a little easier on my router. Here is my first time ever using a router caught on camera. And what do you know? I made a mistake. That's how it goes, right? So when I was adjusting the depth of the cut on my router bit, I failed to notice that the collet that holds the router bit was also down too far and was actually burning a line in my template there. So yeah, pay attention to what you're doing. I started to get the hang of things by the second half of this cut, and you can't see my face, but honestly, I was having a blast. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and this is the most fun I've had in months. Alright, so with all the middle braces routed, I moved on to the top of the workbench and started laying out the positions of all the bench dog holes that we'll be drilling that can accommodate clamps and bench dogs to hold pieces in position as you're doing glue ups or cuts or assembly of large projects. And when I was researching bench designs and kind of deciding what I wanted to build, this is one of the main things that first drew me to Ron Paulk's bench design. He's certainly not the first, obviously, to use bench dog holes in a bench, but the fact that it's laid out across the entire workspace and that you can clamp in any position around the bench, I thought made a lot of sense and gives me the flexibility to kind of, grow with this hobby and work with a lot of different types of projects. I also opted to make the holes 3/4 inches in diameter instead of the 20 millimeters that his plans call for. All the clamps that I currently own, like these Irwin quick clamps, are 3/4 inches wide and will fit perfectly through those holes. So also a lot of the accessories that Rockler offers, like some of their bench dogs and other things that drop through these holes in the bench, are all 3/4 inches in diameter. So that kind of seemed like the imperial standard for diameter. So just something to think about. I definitely took my time laying everything out as precisely as I could do, at least by hand, because I want to be able to use this bench later on for assembly of things like cabinet drawers, things that need to be in perfect square, and I'm hoping to be able to use these holes as a guide to do that quicker. And just to make sure the holes end up where I wanted them, I took a center hole punch and put a little small indent where every hole needs to go so the drill bit doesn't wander once I go to start drilling. Then I used an 1/8 inch drill bit to drill pilot holes all the way through, and I used this little drill guide that I found at Home Depot for a couple bucks one time. You gotta be careful going in there, you end up walking out with more than you went in for. But this was really handy just to make sure all the pilot holes were totally perpendicular to the face of the board. And here's a suggestion that I picked up from watching Ron Paulk's overview video of building this bench. I'm using a Forstner bit to pre-drill part of the way through from the underside. That way when you go to finish the holes from the top side, you get less tear out in the plywood. I took the time to do this Not sure if it was totally necessary, as you're not really going to see the underside of this very often, but again, I just wanted to kind of go the extra mile and make sure I did this right. This step is a bit of a digression, but I actually drilled one hole all the way through and realized that I couldn't hold the drill as perpendicular and make as straight of a hole as I would have liked. And so I just took some scrap plywood, made a couple miter cuts, and put a spacer in between, and basically made like a poor man's drill guide that I could line the drill up with and make sure all the holes that I drilled were, again, perfectly perpendicular to the top of the bench, to make sure that any accessories that I want to insert, like clamps or bench dogs, will fit in without any issue. All told, I think I ended up with 140 something holes that I drilled into the top of this bench. So kind of meditative, get in the zone a little bit and shake off the occasional hand cramp and just try to enjoy the process. So while I was drilling all those holes, I got to thinking about, when this is done, how the heck I'm going to lift this bench up and put it up on the horses when I want to go to use it. It's 3/4 inch birch plywood. It's not the lightest material ever. So I decided to modify the original design and cut a crude handle into the bottom of the bench. Just using a Forstner bit and a jigsaw to cut out a little spot for my hand to go and pick this up and move it around the shop. Quick little touch up with the sander, and this thing was good to go. So I'm really happy that I decided to do this, because there's no way that I could reach across and pick this thing up without it. And on to final assembly, and I was getting really excited to see this thing take shape, until I realized I made another mistake. So I actually cut all 4 of the cross braces to be the width of the entire bench, not realizing that these have to fit inside the 2 side rails. So they actually need to be 3/4 inch shorter on each end. So I called it a wrap for the night and revisited the problem the next day. And the easiest solution I could think of was just to tape all 4 cross braces together so they all end up exactly the same width, and use the opportunity to get some good B-roll using the chop saw. And perfect fit, for real this time. So just laying it out and pocket screwing everything together, it's pretty straightforward from this point on. I did opt to glue everything together just to make sure I get the longest life possible out of this bench, and hid my little mistake with the router there in the middle so nobody will see it. We just won't tell anybody. And my daughter even dropped in to lend a hand. Last piece is screwing the bottom to the bench. See the handle there? It already came in handy. I opted not to glue this down because I figured at some point I may need a reason to access the interior of the bench. It's going to be a lot easier to do if the bottom's not glued down. But I just marked out the location of all those cross braces for my screw holes and went to town pre-drilling and screwing everything down. And that's a wrap. And now the real test to see if I can pick this thing up and move it around. So it's definitely a beast, but I think it's doable with one person with a little concentration and technique. And main thing is it's sturdy, so I'm super happy. And the last thing, really this time, was I opted to put a little round over on every exposed edge of the bench. Mostly just because I wanted another excuse to use the router, but I was actually pleasantly surprised at how much this improved the overall look and definitely the feel of the bench when you're picking it up and moving it around. Just not having any sharp or exposed edges to kind of hurt your hands is a really nice touch, so definitely recommend that. And that's a wrap. This thing's a beauty. I hope this video was helpful for anybody else considering building a workbench or one similar in style. Especially if you're a beginner, you don't need a lot of fancy tools to make this thing happen, and you'll definitely learn a lot of lessons along the way, so I certainly recommend trying it. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll be sure to post an update when I build something with this bench.